Consumer sentiment tumbles with ramifications for the housing market, the share market and the election. 900 of Australia's ultra-rich to be audited and why luxury brands are doing well. It's Thursday, the 14th of April, 2022. Welcome to Fear and Greed, Australia's most popular business podcast. I'm Michael Thompson and good morning, Sean Aylmer.
Good morning, Michael.
Sean, it is a big day for us here at Fear and Greed. Our Safe Word podcast is having its first day out there on its own. A new episode has gone live this morning.
Yes, Safe Word, of course, is a bit different to our regular show, Michael. Certainly different to this morning's Fear and Greed episode. It's loosely business-based, but we certainly go in all sorts of different directions. And it gets a bit awkward at times, let's be honest, a little uncomfortable. That's why we have a safe word for when you need to bail out of the conversation. Now, I've got to say, I think, Michael, it's you and I and Adam Lang, our colleague here at Fear and Greed. I think Adam uses the safe word more than you and I.
I think you're absolutely right. We pretty much refer to him now as Adam Bailout Lang because you just start talking about something and he's dropping the safe word in there. But anyway, you have to listen to Safe Word. You've got to search for it on your podcast platform, Apple Podcasts, Spotify, wherever you listen to podcasts. Just search for Safe Word by Fear and Greed and hit follow. That's Safe Word by Fear and Greed. Search for that, hit follow. You'll get the new episode every Thursday. And look, we really hope you enjoy it.
And if you do, let us know. Send it in a review. Also, be nice to Adam. See, he's not on the show this morning, so you and I, Michael, can say what we want about him. But normally in Safe Word, he's quite able to get his 2 cents worth in. Adam's worth listening to.
Yeah, certainly is. So check it out, Safe Word by Fear and Greed. And Sean, we probably should actually talk about business because that is why we're here.
Ah, yes, let's get into it.
But I'll just give a quick plug to the interview that you've got coming up after this episode. This is a cracker. It's actually one of my favourite ones you've done this year. You're talking to Evan Eakins-Smith. He's from the Australian Electoral Commission, and it is about the logistics of organising the election and just the scale of it. It's just incredible.
As he put it, one of the biggest non-military logistical exercises the country ever undertakes, with thousands of polling booths, hundreds of thousands of workers. Quite incredible. Great interview.
Yeah, certainly is. And we'll have a bit more of a chat about that later on. But the main story this morning, Sean, is all about consumer sentiment, and it's fallen in Australia for the 5th successive month, with ramifications obviously for the share market, the property market, the economy, and of course, the election.
That's right, Michael. The all-important Westpac Melbourne Institute Index of Consumer Sentiment fell again last month. It's almost back to pre-pandemic levels. Rising prices and the risk of higher interest rates are starting to hit home, with households losing confidence in the economic rebound. Now, the Westpac Index is about 20% lower than where it was this time last year. Consumer sentiment is critical to healthy economic performance. If people aren't confident about the future, they don't spend money, and it actually becomes a self-fulfilling proposition. The economy turns around. That's why we care so much about the index.
Sean, the timing of the index is pretty important as well, because this was actually taken after the federal budget. So clearly there was no budget bounce.
No, and I think that would disappoint the government. I think weather and interest rate concerns swept everything else away. Where sentiment really tumbled was among property owners. That was down about 10%. All of a sudden, people with a mortgage are looking at interest rate hikes in 2 months' time, not 2 years' time, which is what the Reserve Bank predicted earlier in this year. And that's part of the reason why we're now seeing house price growth stumble.
Sean, there just seems to be so much noise in the market at the moment. I don't want to be too pessimistic, but is it hard to be confident about anything?
It's a good point. If you take the past 24 hours, we've had the consumer sentiment news. We've had the New Zealand Central Bank hike rates sharply. We've had US inflation come in at a 40-year high. We've had UK inflation come in at a 30-year high. At the same time, you have an election going on in Australia, a war in Europe, very high energy prices, and now growing fears that the world's biggest economy, the US, will find itself in recession at some point next year. So it is really difficult to make investment decisions, and as we always see an expert, but there's just so much noise around at the moment. Mind you, there could be some good news later today, Michael, when the Bureau of Statistics releases its labour force data for March. They should be good numbers.
Okay, what's all this mean then for the election?
It's always a question at the moment, isn't it? Look, incumbent governments want voters to feel good about the economic outlook because that's very fundamental to everyday living. So, on that basis alone, I don't think falling confidence is particularly good for the Morrison government.
All right. How have local financial markets reacted?
Bond prices keep rising, and as we've explained before, that's because traders expect a bunch of interest rate rises later this year. On the equity market, the S&P/ASX 200 rose 0.3% yesterday to finish at 7,479 points. It would have closed higher, but for a very, very sharp drop in the last few minutes of trading. There wasn't a huge amount going on among the large caps. Rio Tinto closed up 2%, while Sonic Healthcare, South32 and Santos all outperformed. Goodman Group was the worst of the large caps. EML Payments was the best performer of the top 200, up more than 10% after media speculation that it was in takeover talks. Uranium miner Paladin Energy rose 9.6%. Now, the price of uranium has been rising recently purely due to the war in Ukraine. So, as a result, Paladin has done pretty well. Next best on the market yesterday was gold miner Regis Resources, which jumped nearly 6%. On the other side of the ledger, the building materials companies had a bad day, with Adbri down 4.6% and James Hardie off nearly 3%. Michael, the Aussie dollar is trading at about 74.5 US cents. Brent crude is back above $100 a barrel, and gold is creeping slowly towards $2,000 an ounce.
All right. Sean, we'll be back in a moment with the rest of the day's business news. Sean, let's start with a bit of an election update. What was Anthony Albanese up to yesterday?
Well, the Labor leader was campaigning on health, promising $135 million for 50 urgent care clinics. His press conferences were notably shorter yesterday, in line with reports that Labor's election planners want Mr Albanese to answer fewer questions and sharpen up his image, following some stumbles, shall we say, earlier in the week. Mr Albanese found himself defending the decision to drop plans to increase the job seeker unemployment benefit in Labor's first budget if elected. He said that it was too expensive to do that. Now, the unemployment benefit was increased $50 a fortnight during COVID, but has dropped back down to $643 a fortnight now. I suspect that one will bug Labor for most weeks of the election.
And the Prime Minister, Scott Morrison, what was he up to?
Well, he was re-announcing a plan to pay the big domestic fuel processing plants $250 million. It's part of a package that was announced last year. Of course, throughout the election campaign, politicians continue to re-announce promises they've already made, and particularly in the case of the coalition, because they've done so much spending over the last couple of years.
And Sean, Greens leader Adam Bandt spoke at the National Press Club.
Yes, he pushed the party's election platform, which includes a $77.6 billion pledge to expand Medicare to allow bulk billing at dentists and orthodontists. It is not unusual for a minor party to have a massive pledge like this one, $77.6 billion. Of course, they don't end up in majority, but they do influence the result, and that's what the Greens are pushing, really, bulk billing for dentists and orthodontists.
And Sean, as we predicted, the media would be asking every politician every statistic they could think of, and that happened to Adam Bandt at the press club with the what was it? I
think it was a wage price index. It was one of those ones, and his response was, "Google it, mate." And I think fair enough. Anyone I don't know what the wage price index is off the top of my head. Maybe Stephen Koukoulas would, perhaps. But I think it's getting a bit ridiculous if journalists are starting to ask uncommon statistics, asking whether pollies know what they are. And I think Adam Bandt's response, "Google it, mate," isn't a bad one.
It's not bad, is it? You'd be too scared to put your head up, wouldn't you? You wouldn't know what's going to come at you. You'd be studying your economic stats all the way back to 1950 just to make sure you were comprehensively covered.
It's a funny thing. I mean, if we ask Scott Morrison or Anthony Albanese or Adam Bandt what the share market closed at today, I guarantee they'd struggle to get within 10% of it, I'm guessing.
Yeah.
I don't know.
Yeah, in the end, it's really all about statistics kind of recall, isn't it?
Yeah.
And yeah. I'm kind of glad that it's not going to be a feature of every press conference that we have between now and the election, because it would get very old. So maybe Adam Bandt has kind of drawn a line in the sand today.
Maybe.
And look, Sean, this all came after LNP member George Christensen defected to One Nation.
Yes, the former Coalition MP who quit the Queensland Liberal National Party last week had said he would leave politics after the election on May 21, but now he's been confirmed as a Senate candidate for One Nation. He said it on the ticket, meaning he's unlikely to end up in Parliament after the election, but not surprisingly, members of the coalition, and particularly Barnaby Joyce, were not impressed.
I can't imagine so. Now, Sean, this next one isn't really one that probably concerned you or I, but
Speak for yourself.
more than 900 of the country's ultra-rich are being audited in detail by the Australian Tax Office due to suspected tax avoidance or non-compliance.
Yes, the ATA got additional funding in last month's federal budget to target wealthy individuals. If you get audited, you might have ATO officers knock on the door at home or visit your workplace. It's expected that offshore money payments, distributions from trusts, and the black economy, which is estimated to be worth around $30 billion, will be the prime targets.
Now, Sean, the tough ride for the buy now, pay later sector continues.
Sure does, Michael. A couple of days ago, Afterpay, which is now owned by Block, said bad debts had doubled. Well, that has sent shivers throughout the whole sector. Sezzle's share price fell to $1.10 yesterday. Now, that's below its IPO price. It listed nearly 3 years ago, and it's 90% below its high back in August 2020. Zipco was down another 2% to another new low. It's down around 85% from its peak. It really is a sector on the nose at the moment.
Sean, dare I ask, what is the latest in the inquiry into the Star and whether it's fit to hold a licence in New South Wales? Because I'm sure something happened yesterday.
Well, before I answer that, can I recommend readers have a look at afr.com or the AFR newspaper and read the rather long piece about why Australia's casino industry has become so rotten. It brings together so much of what we've been talking about, not just in the last few weeks, but actually the last couple of years with Crown as well. Just a great read on bringing it all together and what's at the core of all this. Yesterday, the council assisting the inquiry accused the gaming group's chief risk and legal officer, Paula Martin, of failing to be honest, candid, and frank in her answers and in her knowledge of almost $1 billion of suspicious Chinese debit card transaction. Certainly, Michael, many of Ms. Martin's answers have included clauses about not recalling facts. I think counsel assisting was just getting a bit frustrated.
All right. Now, PointsBet, Sean, which is listed on the ASX but based in the United States, has launched an online casino product in Pennsylvania.
Yes, I've always been a bit fascinated by this stock because it ran so hard. It really surged during the past couple of years as online sports betting became legal in the US state by state. They'd pick up a license, their share price would go up. But as the economy turned and rates started to rise and competition in the sector ramped up, that's a critical part, PointsBet's share price has fallen really, really hard. It's down about 75% over the past year. They've sort of had to go back to the drawing board and work out how to operate in the US, given how much competition's in sports betting. For shareholders' sake, let's hope online gaming can help them out.
Yeah, now, Sean, a few quick ones for you. Gina Rinehart, the country's richest person, has invested in 2 iron ore juniors.
Yes, she has put money into Hawthorn Resources and Legacy Iron Ore. Both of them are ASX-listed companies. She certainly is backing that particular metal.
Yeah, certainly is. And the COVID numbers remain high, Sean. South Australia had another 5,000 cases yesterday.
It did. It's not getting any better in South Australia. And the ACT had nearly 1,100 and Tasmania was 1,800 infections. Queensland was above 9,000, Western Australia 7,400, Victoria was at 11,000. New South Wales, of course, remains the country hotspot with more than 18,000 infections announced yesterday. Across the country, there were 39 deaths recorded yesterday, and there are 3,147 people in hospital.
All right. Sean, how about this one? The High Court has given the okay to fine the CFMEU the maximum penalty even for lesser breaches of the law because it says it's necessary to stop the union's repeated law breaking.
I agree. This is really interesting. The court unanimously overturned a decision of the full federal court that found the maximum penalty should only be reserved for the most serious conduct and so wasn't justified against the construction, forestry, maritime, mining and energy unions' enforcement of its no ticket, no start policy. The High Court found that the purpose of penalties under the Fair Work Act is to primarily, if not solely, deter further breaches. So if you extend that out, if a defendant isn't doing the right thing and continues to breach, no matter what they're doing, they could be hit with really, really big penalties.
It's an interesting one. All right, moving on to overseas news, Sean, and New Zealand's central bank has lifted its benchmark borrowing rates 0.5% to 1.5% and said inflation in the country is expected to peak in the next few months.
The Reserve Bank of New Zealand said the risk of higher inflation expectations had increased and it was better to act now rather than wait to head off inflation. It's a different take to that of the Reserve Bank of Australia, which has consistently said it wants to see inflation and wages sustainably within their target bands before moving. Reserve Bank of New Zealand here is being preemptive, whereas the Reserve Bank of Australia is not. Meanwhile, Michael, consumer price data shows that US consumer prices rose in March by the most in 40 years. Inflation came in at 8.5%, driven higher by petrol and food costs. A Fed official afterwards said it was fantasy to think modest rate rises will tame inflation. And in Britain, annual inflation last month hit 7%, the highest since 1992.
Sean, what's the latest on the war in Ukraine?
Reuters is reporting that the Biden administration is preparing a military assistance package of roughly $750 million for Ukraine. The spend will be on weapons and equipment. The news comes as Russian President Vladimir Putin vowed to continue pursuing the war, and US President Joe Biden accused him of committing genocide. Meanwhile, Michael, the fighting goes on.
It does. All right, and finally, Sean, luxury brands are having their moment in the sun with the world's biggest luxury group, LVMH, reporting strong first quarter sales.
And this comes despite a resurgence of COVID in China, which is now the second largest luxury market behind the US. Luxury brands are doing really well at the moment, with a big jump in prices for high-end jewellery and watches. As inflation rises and petrol, electricity and food costs increase, those most affected are in lower socio-economic groups. The rich don't feel the pain of more expensive petrol, basically. Well, at least not as much as the poor do. It seems that the rich are now spending up big, in contrary to more pessimistic forecasts a few months ago. In LVMH's case, its biggest brands, Louis Vuitton and Dior, are among the best performers. What luxury brands have, that many other brands don't have, is pricing power. They can pass through higher input costs. And one close to your heart, Michael, the weakest performers of the LVMH brands, Moet and Hennessy Cognac.
Really? That's because we've all moved on to gin, I think, Sean.
I think so.
I've got nothing to base that on except for the fact that I've recently discovered gin. So probably don't invest on the strength of that.
I must say, I told you I went to the Royal Easter Show in Sydney the other day. We got there late. The animals were all in bed. We went gin tasting and we came home with 4 bottles of gin, which is not how I used to go to the Royal Easter Show, but we did this time.
That is a fantastic way to visit the show.
Absolutely.
Oh, well played. All right. Now, up next is the Fear and Greed Daily interview. We mentioned it earlier. You're speaking with Evan Eakins-Smith from the AEC.
Who knew putting on an election was such hard work? And Evan is very entertaining as well. He's a bit of a raconteur, and so he tells great stories of getting things organised and into place, and just how much hard work really goes in to run an election. Also, the benefits of running an election in Australia vis-a-vis in the US, where you've got all sorts of different electoral systems, whereas at least here we only have one.
Yeah, it's a really good interview. It's up next in the Fear and Greed playlist on your podcast platform or at fearandgreed.com.au. Thank you, Sean.
Thank you, Michael.
It's Thursday, the 14th of April, 2022. Make sure you're following the podcast. Join us online on LinkedIn, Twitter, and Facebook. And don't forget, search for Safe Word by Fear and Greed. A new episode has been released this morning. I'm Michael Thompson, and that was Fear and Greed. Have a great day.